Found under an old cabin floor, after 33 years, a disappearance finally solved. The pry-bar wind, a high metallic shriek that sliced through 33 years of silence. It was the sound of a tomb cracking open. Rusty nails, thick as a man's thumb, surrendered with agonizing groans, their heads tearing through the warped pine floorboards. Dust, not the fine floaty kind, but a thick, greasy blanket of it, billowed up, carrying the smell of damp earth, forgotten decay, and something else. Something acrid and deeply wrong. Jesus, Mike, you smell that? Leo's voice was muffled by the N95 mask stretched across his face. He spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dirt just beyond the cabin's crumbling foundation. His breath plumed. In the frigid November air, a ghost of a complaint. Mike didn't answer. He was too focused on the board in his hands. It was heavier than the others, unnaturally so. He grunted, his forearms cording with strain as he heaved it up and over, flipping it onto the pile they'd been making. That's when he saw it. Not the source of the smell, not yet, but the first hint of the secret the cabin had been keeping. Scratched into the underside of the floorboard, carved with what must have been a nail or a shard of glass, were words, frantic, desperate, clawed into the wood. He put me here. Sheriff, don't believe him. Lila, Mike froze. His gloves gritty with ancient filth. He stared at the name, Leela. The name was a ghost in this town. A cautionary tale whispered to teenage girls who stayed out too late. Lila Abernathy vanished without a trace in the summer of '89. They'd searched these woods for months. A grim parade of volunteers and deputies on horseback, their faces etched with a hope that slowly curdled into resignation. They found nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of cloth, not a single drop of blood. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed her whole. What is it? Leo shuffled closer, his boots crunching on the debris. He peered over Mike's shoulder, his own breath catching. Holy hell. But the words weren't the worst of it. The smell, now that the board was lifted, was a physical force. It punched up from the crawlspace, a gut-wrenching miasma of rot and chemical sweetness. It was the smell of spoiled meat left too long in the sun, of a dead thing trying to mask its own putrefaction. Mike felt his stomach clench. The half-eaten gas station burrito threatening a violent return. He grabbed his high-powered flashlight from his tool belt. Its beam cutting a clean white cone through the swirling dust. He aimed it into the dark. More of the crawlspace. The ground beneath the cabin was a mess of packed dirt, cobwebs thick as cotton candy, and the skeletal remains of long-dead rodents. And something else. A shape. A long, lumpy, vaguely human-sized shape, wrapped in what looked like a heavy-duty agricultural tarp. The kind farmers used to cover hay bales, thick and green and waterproof. It was singed tight with baling wire. The metal rusted to a deep, angry orange. No, Leo whispered, taking a step back, his hand flying to his mouth. No way. Mike felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a dread that had nothing to do with the biting wind. He'd lived in this county his whole life. He remembered the summer Leela disappeared. He'd been a teenager himself, full of swagger and cheap beer. But even he had felt the chill of her absence settle over the community. He remembered her face from the missing posters tacked to every telephone pole and storefront window. A bright, hopeful smile. Eyes full of a future she never got to have. The word on the floorboard burned in his mind. Sheriff Brody. He'd been the one to lead the search. A pillar of the community. A man whose folksy charm and iron sense of justice were the stuff of local legend. He'd been the one to comfort Leela's weeping mother on the local news, his big, reassuring hand on her shoulder. He'd been the one to finally, regretfully, declare the case cold. "We gotta call this in," Leo stammered, his voice trembling. "We gotta call the cops. Now." The word Mike said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "It says, Sheriff." Leo's eyes widened in dawning horror. "You don't think, you can't think. I think we need to be careful who we call," Mike said. His gaze fixed on the tarp-wrapped bundle. He swung his legs over the edge of the floor and dropped into the crawlspace. The air was thick and cloying, coating the back of his throat. He landed with a soft thud on the damp earth. Every instinct screamed at him to climb back out, to run from this place and never look back. But the desperate scrawl on the wood, the ghost of a girl named Lila, held him there. He moved closer to the bundle, his flashlight beam trembling in his hand. The tarp was brittle with age, cracked in places. Through one of the cracks, he could see something. A flash of color, faded, but still recognizable. Denim blue. With a shaking hand, he reached out and touched the tarp. It was cold, unnaturally cold. He found a loose end of the baling wire and began to tug at it. The wire bit into his gloved fingers, but he pulled harder, his breath held tight in his chest. The wire snapped with a dull twang. He started to unwrap the tarp, the plastic crinkling with a sound that seemed deafening in the suffocating silence. The smell intensified, a physical assault that made his eyes water and his gorge rise. He peeled back a corner of the green plastic dot, and then he saw it. Bone, a human hand, skeletal and delicate, the fingers slightly curled as if reaching for something. On one of the bony fingers, a silver ring, tarnished with age, with a small, turquoise stone. He remembered that ring. It had been in all the photos. Lila's favorite ring, a gift from her grandmother. Mike recoiled as if he'd been burned, scrambling backward on his hands and knees, a strangled cry escaping his lips. He hit the foundation wall with a jarring thud, the flashlight clattering from his grasp and rolling across the dirt floor, its beam spinning wildly, illuminating the horror in frantic strobing flashes. The tarp, the hand, the ring. Leo was screaming now, a raw, panicked sound that echoed through the skeletal trees surrounding the cabin. Oh God, oh God, oh God. Mike's mind was a maelstrom of images and emotions. Lila's smiling face on the posters, the frantic words carved into the wood, the name of the man who was supposed to protect them. Sheriff. Sheriff Brody was retired now, a beloved local icon living out his golden years on a sprawling ranch just outside of town. He was a grandfather, a church deacon, a man who still got a standing ovation at the annual Founders Day parade. And he was a monster. A cold, calculating fury began to replace the shock. An injustice, 33 years old, had just been unearthed. A girl's silent scream had finally been heard. And he, Mike, a 48-year-old contractor with a bad back and a mortgage, was standing in her grave. He pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He grabbed the flashlight, his hand steady now, his purpose clear. He looked at the bundle, at the small, skeletal hand, and made a silent promise to the girl who had been buried here. "We're getting you out of here, Lila," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "And we're going to make him pay." He climbed out of the crawlspace, his face a grim mask. Leo was pacing back and forth, his hands tangled in his hair, his eyes wide with terror. "We called the state police," Mike said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Not the local guys, not anyone who knows Brody. We call the state police, and we don't touch another damn thing." He pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling with the screen. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if the world he had known just 10 minutes ago had fractured, revealing a dark and terrifying reality beneath. The woods, which had always been a place of peace and solitude for him, now seemed menacing, the trees like silent, complicit witnesses. The wind whispering through their bare branches sounded like a name. Lila. As he dialed the number for the state police barracks an hour away, his eyes fell back on the floorboard he had removed. The carved words seemed to glow with a faint, ethereal light. It wasn't just a message, it was a testament. A final, desperate act of defiance from a girl who refused to be erased. A time bomb, set 33 years ago, that had just exploded in their faces. The dispatcher's voice on the other end of the line was calm and professional, a stark contrast to the chaos raging in Mike's mind. "State Police, how can I help you?" Mike took a deep breath, the foul air of the crawlspace still clinging to him like a shroud. "My name is Mike Jennings," he said, his voice shaking but firm. My partner and I are renovating a cabin off Old Mill Road. We just found something. We just found a body." He paused, the next words tasting like poison in his mouth. "We think it's Leela Abernathy, and we think we know who put her here." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then, the dispatcher's voice, sharp and urgent. "Sir, don't move. Don't touch anything. We're on our way." But Mike knew this was just the beginning. The real storm was coming. A storm that would tear their quiet little town apart, and at the center of it all was a retired sheriff, a beloved local hero, and a secret he had buried under the floorboards of a forgotten cabin, a secret that was now, finally, screaming to be heard. The cliffhanger wasn't just about the body. It was about the impossible accusation they were about to make. An accusation that would pit two ordinary working men against the most powerful and revered figure in their county's history. The weight of Lila's last words settled upon Mike's shoulders, a burden he knew he would carry until the truth, in all its ugliness, was brought into the light. The summer of '89 had been suffocatingly hot, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the drone of cicadas. It was the kind of heat that made secrets fester. For Leela Abernathy, it was the summer she turned 17. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional, small-town pageant way. Her beauty was wilder, more untamed. She had a cascade of unruly auburn hair that she was constantly trying to tame with a blue bandana, eyes the color of moss after a rainstorm, and a laugh that was too loud for the church pews but perfect for the back of a pickup truck. Flying down a dirt road, her life was a map of fault lines. Her father had died in a logging accident when she was 10, leaving her and her mother, Sarah, adrift in a sea of quiet grief and mounting bills. Sarah worked double shifts at the diner, her hands perpetually smelling of bleach and fried onions, her face etched with a permanent exhaustion that Lila felt as a constant low-grade ache in her own chest. Lila was her mother's opposite. Where Sarah was worn down and cautious, Lila was a spark of raw, untethered energy. She dreamed of escaping their small, suffocating town, of going to art school in a city where no one knew her name or the story of her family's tragedy. Her escape fund, painstakingly saved from her part-time job at the local grocery store, was hidden in a hollowed-out copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. It was her most prized possession, a tangible symbol of a future she was desperate to claim. The antagonist in Leela's story didn't wear a black hat. He wore a crisp, tan sheriff's uniform and a smile that could charm a snake out of its skin. Sheriff Brody was more than a lawman. He was an institution. He'd been elected sheriff for times, running unopposed for the last two. He was handsome in a rugged, sun-weathered way, with a thick head of silvering hair and eyes as blue and cold as a mountain lake. He projected an aura of unshakable authority and paternalistic care. He was the man you called when your cat was stuck in a tree or your son got into a fistfight behind the bleachers. He knew everyone's name, remembered their birthdays, and always had a kind word for the ladies at the bake sale. But beneath the polished surface, there was a chilling darkness. Brody had a proprietary view of the town and its inhabitants. He saw it as his kingdom, and he ruled it with a quiet, insidious tyranny. He had a particular weakness for young, vulnerable women, especially those who, like Lila, had a spark of defiance in their eyes. He saw them as a challenge, a conquest. His attentions began subtly. A lingering hand on her arm when she was stocking shelves at the grocery store. A patrol car that just happened to be parked outside the diner when her mother's shift ended. He'd offer them a ride home, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. His presence filling the small space of the car, making the air feel thin and hard to breathe. He told Lila she was special, that she had a fire in her that the other girls lacked. He made her feel seen in a way that no one else did. He preyed on her loneliness, on her yearning for a father figure, for someone strong to lean on. He was a master manipulator, weaving a web of intimacy and obligation that was as strong as steel. He'd give her mother a break on a speeding ticket, or have a word with the landlord who was threatening to raise their rent. Small favors he'd call them, with a wink and a smile. But they weren't favors, They were chains. The hidden witness was a boy named Ethan, a boy who lived in the shadows of his older brother's long athletic frame. Ethan was 16 that summer, a quiet, observant kid with a camera permanently slung around his neck. He was the town's invisible boy, the one who saw everything because no one ever bothered to look at him. He was hopelessly, achingly in love with Lila Abernathy. He loved her from afar, capturing her in stolen moments on his camera. Lila laughing with her friends. Lila frowning in concentration as she sketched in her notebook. Lila staring off into the distance, a look of fierce determination on her face. He had a whole shoebox full of photos of her, a secret shrine to a girl who barely knew he existed. Ethan's older brother, Mark, was the town's golden boy, star quarterback, homecoming king, and, for a brief tumultuous period that summer, Lila's boyfriend. Mark was everything Ethan wasn't: confident, popular, and blissfully unaware of the nuances of the world around him. He liked Lila because she was pretty and a little wild, a trophy to be shown off to his friends. He didn't understand the depths of her soul, the fire in her heart. He didn't see the shadows that were starting to gather around her. The conflict began to escalate one hot July evening. Lila had had a fight with her mother, a bitter, tear-filled argument about money and her future. She'd stormed out of their small, cramped apartment and had gone to the only place she felt she could breathe: the old, abandoned logging cabin on the edge of the woods. It was her secret sanctuary, a place where she could dream and draw and feel free. Sheriff Brody's patrol car found her there, its headlights cutting through the twilight like a predator's gaze. He got out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't seem surprised to see her. It was as if he had known she would be there. "Everything all right, Lila?" he asked, his voice soft, concerned. She told him about the fight, the words tumbling out of her in a rush of anger and frustration. He listened patiently, his blue eyes fixed on her face. When she was done, he stepped closer, his presence looming over her. "Your mother doesn't understand you," he said, his voice a low, hypnotic murmur. "But I do. I see the real you, Lila. I see the artist, the dreamer. You're meant for more than this town." He reached out and tucked a stray strand of her auburn hair behind her ear, his fingers brushing against her skin. The touch was electric, a jolt of something that was both thrilling and terrifying. It was a violation of a boundary she hadn't even known existed. She tried to pull away, but his hand moved to her shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't be scared," he whispered, his voice losing its gentle edge, replaced by something harder, more possessive. "I can help you. I can give you everything you want." That was the moment the charm shattered, revealing the monster beneath. Lila saw the cold, predatory hunger in his eyes, and a primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She shoved him, hard, and ran. She ran through the woods, the branches tearing at her clothes and skin, her heart pounding in her ears. She didn't stop running until she reached the safety of her own front door. She never told anyone what happened. Who would believe her? He was Sheriff Brody, the town's hero. She was just a troubled girl from the wrong side of the tracks. He would twist the story, make it her fault. He would ruin her. After that night, the fear was a constant companion. She felt his eyes on her everywhere she went. His patrol car would appear in her rearview mirror, following her for miles before turning off without a signal. He started to show up at the grocery store, his presence a silent, menacing threat. He would stand at the end of the aisle, watching her, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. He was toying with her, enjoying her terror. The hidden witness, Ethan, saw it all through the lens of his camera. He had been in the woods that evening, trying to capture the sunset, when he'd seen the sheriff's car pull up to the cabin. He'd hidden in the bushes, his heart pounding, and had watched the scene unfold. He'd seen the look on Lila's face, the raw terror in her eyes as she ran. He had even snapped a photo, a blurry, grainy image of Lila fleeing, and the sheriff standing by his car, a dark, imposing silhouette against the dying light. But Ethan was a coward. He was terrified of Brody, of what the sheriff could do to him, to his family. His brother, Mark, revered the sheriff. Brody had been the one to give him a glowing character reference for his college applications. To accuse the sheriff would be to betray his own brother, to bring shame and ruin upon his family. So he buried the photos in the shoebox with the others, a guilty secret that festered in his soul. The final brutal escalation came on the night of the annual town fair. It was a humid, starless night, the air thick with the smell of popcorn and cheap perfume. Lila had gone with Mark, but they had argued. Mark had been drinking with his friends, and he'd become possessive and cruel, accusing her of flirting. With other boys, he'd grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh, and for a terrifying moment, she had seen the same possessive hunger in his eyes that she had seen in Brody's. She broke away from him and ran, tears of anger and humiliation streaming down her face. She just wanted to go home, to lock herself in her room, and pretend this night had never happened. As she was cutting through the dimly lit parking lot behind the high school, a figure stepped out from between two cars, blocking her path. It was Sheriff Brody, leaving so soon. He asked, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice trembling. He laughed, a cold, empty sound. "I don't think so. You and I have some unfinished business." He grabbed her, his hand clamping over her mouth. Stifling her scream, he was incredibly strong, his grip like iron. He dragged her towards his patrol car, his other hand fumbling with the back door. She fought back with a ferocity born of pure terror. She bit his hand, tasting the salt and grime of his skin. He swore, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all the time she needed. She kicked him, hard, in the shin, and wrenched herself free. She ran, not towards the lights of the fair, but towards the darkness of the woods that bordered the parking lot. She could hear him behind her, his heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. She was faster, more agile, but he was relentless. She didn't know that Ethan, heartbroken and worried after seeing her fight with his brother, had followed her. He had seen the whole thing from the shadows of the bleachers. He had seen Brody grab her, had seen her fight back and run. And, paralyzed by fear, he had done nothing. He had simply stood there, hidden in the darkness, as the girl he loved ran for her life. He watched as Brody disappeared into the woods after her, and the sounds of the chase faded into the chirping of the crickets. It was the last time anyone ever saw Lila Abernathy alive. The next morning, the town would wake up to the news of her disappearance. And Sheriff Brody, his hand bandaged from a dog bite, would lead the search, his face a mask of grim concern, fooling everyone except for one boy, who was now a prisoner of his own silent, suffocating guilt. The days following Lila's disappearance were a blur of organized panic. Sheriff Brody was the calm at the center of the storm, a beacon of stoic competence in a town drowning in fear. He set up a command post at the fire station. The walls covered with topographical maps crisscrossed with red lines marking search grids. He held daily press conferences on the courthouse steps, his voice resonating with a carefully calibrated mixture of authority and empathy. He looked directly into the news cameras, his cold blue eyes projecting an image of unwavering resolve. "We will not rest," he'd say, his voice a gravelly promise, "until we bring Lila home." For Sarah Abernathy, it was a waking nightmare. The world had shrunk to the four walls of her small apartment, a space that now felt cavernously empty without Lila's vibrant, chaotic presence. Lila's half-finished drawings were still tacked to the wall, her worn-out sneakers were still by the door, and her copy of To Kill a Mockingbird was still on her nightstand. Sarah would sit in Lila's room for hours, clutching one of her daughter's sweaters, trying to inhale some lingering trace of her, a scent, a memory, anything. Sheriff Brody was a frequent visitor. He would come by with a pot of coffee or a bag of groceries, his presence filling the small apartment with a suffocating mixture of feigned concern and unspoken menace. He would sit at her kitchen table, his large hands wrapped around a mug, and would tell her about the search efforts. He would talk about the difficult terrain, the lack of evidence, the fading hope. He was planting seeds of despair, carefully, methodically, ensuring that she would eventually give up, that she would accept the unacceptable. "We're doing everything we can, Sarah," he would say, his voice a soft, sympathetic purr. But his eyes told a different story. When he looked at her, she saw a flicker of something cold and triumphant, a look that made her skin crawl. She felt a deep, instinctual distrust of him, a feeling she couldn't articulate but couldn't shake. It was the same feeling she'd had when Lila had come home that night from the old cabin, pale and trembling, refusing to say what had happened. The injustice began to escalate in small, cruel ways. Brody, in his official capacity, started to subtly shift the narrative of Lila's disappearance. He began to leak information to the local newspaper, painting a picture of Lila as a troubled, rebellious teenager. He spoke of her history of running away, a gross exaggeration of the few times she had stayed out past her curfew. He mentioned her unstable home life, a cruel jab at Sarah's struggle as a single mother. He was no longer searching for a missing victim. He was building a case against her character, posthumously. He was turning her into a ghost who had brought her fate upon herself. The town, desperate for an explanation, a way to make sense of the senseless, began to buy into this narrative. The whispers started in the checkout line at the grocery store, in the pews at church. You know, she was always a wild one. I heard she was mixed up with a bad crowd. Her mother, bless her heart, just couldn't control her. The sympathy that had initially poured out for Sarah began to curdle into a kind of pitying condescension, tinged with blame. The search parties grew smaller. The missing posters began to fade and tear in the sun and rain, their hopeful smiles turning into grotesque, water-stained grimaces. For Ethan, the guilt was a physical thing, a heavy, suffocating weight in his chest. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the scene in the parking lot. Lila's terrified face, Brody's menacing silhouette, his own cowardly inaction. He was haunted by the sound of her footsteps fading into the darkness. He tried to talk to his brother Mark. Once he found him in their shared bedroom, lifting weights, his face a mask of sullen anger. Mark had been questioned by Brody, a routine interview as Lila's boyfriend. Mark had told the sheriff about their fight, about how she had run off. He had inadvertently provided the foundation for Brody's narrative of a runaway. "My fault," Mark said, his voice thick with a mixture of grief and machismo. "I pushed her away. I made her run off." "It's not your fault," Ethan whispered, his heart pounding. "There was someone else there. I saw what—" Mark stopped lifting, the barbell clattering to the floor. "What did you see?" Ethan's courage failed him. He looked at his brother's face, at the raw, uncomplicated grief, and he couldn't bring himself to say the name. He couldn't shatter his brother's world, couldn't destroy his hero worship of the sheriff. He couldn't face the consequences of his own cowardice. "Nothing," he mumbled. "I just meant, it wasn't your fault." Mark, lost in his own self-recrimination, didn't press the issue. The moment passed, and the secret remained buried. A toxic seed in Ethan's soul. The true cruelty of the antagonist, however, was yet to be fully revealed. Brody, not content with merely covering his tracks, began to actively torment those who he felt might pose a threat. He started with Sarah. He knew she was suspicious of him. He could see it in her eyes. So he decided to break her. He arranged for Lila's secret escape fund, her copy of To Kill a Mockingbird with the money tucked inside, to be discovered by a search volunteer near a bus station 2 towns over. It was a brilliant, diabolical move. It was presented to Sarah in a sterile evidence bag, a concrete symbol of her daughter's supposed abandonment. "It seems she just left, Sarah," Brody said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Some kids, they just have a wanderlust you can't tame." The discovery was a devastating blow to Sarah. It seemed to confirm all the whispers, all the doubts. Had her daughter really just run away, without a word, without a goodbye? The hope that had been a flickering candle in her heart was extinguished, replaced by a cold, bitter sense of betrayal. She withdrew even further, a ghost in her own life, the town's tragic figure, the mother of the girl who ran away. Brody's attention then turned to Ethan. He didn't know for sure what Ethan had seen, but he was a man who left nothing to chance. He began to subtly intimidate the boy. He would park his patrol car outside Ethan's house at night, the engine idling, a silent, menacing presence in the darkness. He would pull Ethan over for no reason, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered gun as he asked for his license and registration. He would show up at the high school, his eyes finding Ethan in the crowded hallway, a cold, knowing smile on his lips. The message was clear. I know you saw something, and I can destroy you. The fear was a constant metallic taste in Ethan's mouth. He stopped taking pictures. The camera, which had once been his shield, his way of observing the world from a safe distance, now felt like a liability, a piece of evidence. He hid the shoebox of photos, including the grainy image from that night, in the back of his closet, burying it under a pile of old clothes. He was trying to bury the truth, to bury his own conscience. The final brutal betrayal came from the town itself. A few months after Leela's disappearance, the town council, at Sheriff Brody's suggestion, decided to hold a memorial service for her. It wasn't a gesture of genuine remembrance. It was a ritual of closure, a way for the town to officially move on, to close the book on the uncomfortable story of the girl who ran away. The service was held at the community church. It was a somber, hypocritical affair. People who had whispered about Lila behind her back now dabbed their eyes with tissues. The mayor gave a speech about the tragedy of a life cut short, carefully avoiding any mention of the ugly rumors. Sheriff Brody was the final speaker. He stood at the pulpit, the picture of a grieving public servant. He spoke of Leela's bright spirit and the hole she had left in the community. He looked directly at Sarah, who sat in the front pew, a hollowed-out shell of a woman. We may never know why Lila chose to leave us, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But we can honor her memory by coming together as a community, by looking out for one another, by ensuring that our children feel safe and loved. It was a masterful performance. He was using Leela's memory to reinforce his own power, to cast himself as the town's protector, its benevolent father figure. He was burying his crime under a mountain of public sanctimony. Ethan sat in the back of the church, his stomach churning with a mixture of guilt and rage. He watched Brody, the man he knew was a monster, being feted as a hero. He saw the townspeople, his friends, his neighbors, his own family, being manipulated, their grief being used as a tool of deception. As Brody finished his speech and the organ began to play a mournful hymn, Ethan's eyes met the sheriff's across the crowded church. For a fleeting second, Brody's mask of grief slipped. Ethan saw a look of pure, triumphant evil, a look that said, I won, you lost, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it. In that moment, something inside Ethan snapped. The fear that had held him paralyzed for so long was burned away. By a white-hot rage, he stood up, his hands clenched into fists, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to scream, to shout the truth, to tear down the whole rotten facade, but he didn't. The habit of fear was too deeply ingrained. He turned and fled the church, running out into the cold, empty street, the sound of the hymn chasing him. Like a chorus of ghosts, he ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, collapsing onto the curb, gasping for breath. His body racked with sobs of helpless, impotent fury. The conflict had escalated beyond a single horrific crime. It had become a conspiracy of silence, a moral rot that had infected the entire town. With the antagonist growing bolder, the victim's memory being desecrated, and the lone witness, trapped in a prison of his own making, tormented by a truth that was as undeniable as it was unspeakable. 30-3 years is a long time. It's long enough for a town to forget, for memories to soften and blur, for a monster to become a beloved icon. James Brody, the retired sheriff, was now a grandfather with a gentle smile and a slight stoop. He lived on a sprawling ranch, a local patriarch who spent his days mending fences and telling stories to his adoring grandchildren. The ghost of Leela Abernathy had long since been laid to rest, a sad footnote in the town's history. But truth has a way of refusing to stay buried. The plot twist didn't come from a dramatic confession or a long-lost witness finally finding their courage. It came from a place of quiet, forgotten grief. After the initial shock of the discovery at the cabin, after the state police had cordoned off the area and the forensic teams had moved in, the news, carefully managed and stripped of its most Explosive detail. The name carved into the floorboard hit the community like a distant tremor. Human remains found at old cabin, the headline read, believed to be linked to 1989 disappearance. For most, it was a morbid curiosity, a dredging up of an old story. But for Sarah Abernathy, it was a seismic shock. The fragile piece she had built over 3 decades shattered into a million pieces. The discovery reawakened the one question that had never truly died, the one that had haunted her sleepless nights. What really happened to my daughter? The state police, led by a sharp no-nonsense detective named Isabella Rossi, were methodical. They confirmed the remains were Lila's. They confirmed the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. But they had a problem. The crime was 33 years old. The trail was frozen solid. The primary person of interest from the original investigation, Mark Lila's boyfriend, had a solid alibi for the night she disappeared. The case was a historical puzzle with too many missing pieces. The key, a clue that would change everything, was not in a police file, but in a dusty, forgotten corner of Sarah Abernathy's attic. Driven by a renewed, desperate need to connect with the daughter she had lost, Sarah began to go through Lila's old things. The clothes, the books, the drawings. It was a painful pilgrimage into the past. In the bottom of a trunk filled with Lila's childhood artwork, she found it. It was an old cassette tape, the kind used in a personal tape recorder. It was unlabeled. Sarah vaguely remembered Lila having a small, cheap recorder she'd bought at a yard sale. She'd used it to record ideas for her art, snippets of conversations, the sounds of nature. Sarah hadn't thought about it in years. She had to go to a thrift store to find a cassette player that still worked. Back in her quiet, lonely house, with trembling hands, she pushed the tape into the machine and pressed play. The sound that came out was a hiss of static, then the faint, tinny sound of Lila's voice, young and full of life. It was a jolt to Sarah's heart, a voice from the grave. For the first few minutes, it was just what she expected, Lila talking to herself, describing a dream she'd had, the sound of birds chirping, the rustle of leaves. Sarah listened, tears streaming down her face, a bittersweet ache in her chest, and then everything changed. The sound of a car door slamming. A man's voice, low and familiar. Thought I might find you here. It was him, Brody. His voice, younger, but unmistakably his. The sound of it sent a jolt of ice water through Sarah's veins. Lila's voice, hesitant, nervous. What do you want, Sheriff? Just wanted to talk. Make sure you're okay. You seemed upset the other night. The tape recorder was still running, forgotten, capturing the conversation from inside Lila's backpack. It was the conversation from that evening at the cabin, the one that had sent Lila running in terror. The one she had never told her mother about. Sarah listened. Her breath held tight in her chest as the conversation unfolded. She heard Brody's voice, dripping with false concern, slowly turning more menacing, more possessive. She heard him talk about her fire, about how he understood her. She heard the shift in his tone, the hard, predatory edge that emerged. I can help you, Lila, his voice on the tape said. I can give you everything you want. You just have to be cooperative. Then, the sound of a struggle, a gasp. From Lila, a muffled thump. Don't be scared, Brody's voice whispered, a chilling, venomous sound. Don't fight me, Lila's voice, no longer hesitant, but sharp with fear and defiance. Get away from me. The sound of running footsteps, of branches snapping. The tape kept recording for another 10 minutes, capturing only the sound of the wind and the distant cry of a bird. Before it clicked off, Sarah sat in stunned silence, the cassette player humming softly. She had just listened to the sound of her daughter being assaulted. She had just heard the proof that the man who had pretended to comfort her, the man who had led the search, the man who had become a town hero, was a monster. The conspiracy, which had been a vague, instinctual feeling for her, was now a stark, undeniable reality. He hadn't just killed her daughter. He had orchestrated the entire cover-up. The narrative of the runaway, the planted evidence of the money at the bus station, The public memorial lit was all a calculated, diabolical plan to bury his crime. But the tape wasn't the only secret that was about to surface. In another part of town, the news of the discovery had shaken another soul to its core. Ethan, now a quiet, middle-aged man who taught high school photography, felt the guilt of his 33-year-old silence come crashing down on him. He had built a life, had a family, had tried to forget. But he had never been able to throw away the shoebox. He retrieved it from the back of his closet, the cardboard soft with age. He sifted through the photos of Lila, her smiling face, a painful reminder of his own failure. And at the very bottom, he found the one he had hidden away. The one he had been too afraid to look at for 3 decades, the photo from the woods. It was grainy, taken from a distance, but the image was clear enough. The silhouette of Brody, standing by his patrol car, and in the foreground, a flash of auburn hair, the back of a girl running in terror. It was the moment before the end. Ethan stared at the photograph, his hands shaking. It was the corroboration, the visual proof of what the tape had recorded for 33 years. He had been a prisoner of his fear. But now, seeing the image, hearing the news of Lila's body being found, something shifted in him. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a profound, soul-deep shame. He had let Lila down. He had let her mother down. He had let the truth die in the darkness of his own cowardice. The stakes had shifted. This was no longer just about Lila's murder. It was about a systematic, 33-year-long deception perpetrated by the most powerful man in the county. It was about the corruption of power, the abuse of trust, the moral decay of a town that had chosen to believe a comfortable lie rather than face an ugly truth. It was a public scandal of epic proportions, waiting to explode. Sarah, clutching the cassette tape, knew she couldn't go to the local authorities. Brody's influence ran too deep. Too many people owed him favors. Too many people still saw him as a hero. She needed to go to someone from the outside, someone who couldn't be intimidated or bought. She thought of the detective from the state police, Rossi. She had seemed tough, professional, immune to the small-town politics. Ethan, holding the photograph, came to the same conclusion. He couldn't live with the silence anymore. He had to speak, no matter the cost. He looked up the number for the state police barracks, his finger hovering over the dial button. The tension was now at its absolute maximum. 2 separate threads of evidence, a secret recording and a hidden photograph, held by 2 separate people who had been living in their own private hells, were about to converge. The full, monstrous scope of Brody's crime was about to be exposed. Sarah put the cassette tape in her purse, her movements slow and deliberate, her face a mask of grim determination. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She was an avenger. Ethan took a deep breath and pressed the dial button on his phone. He was no longer a cowardly boy. He was a witness, finally ready to testify. The storm that Mike and Leo had unwittingly unleashed when they pried up that first floorboard was about to break, and it was going to be more devastating than anyone could have ever imagined. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, not for a quiet resolution, but for a public explosion that would force the town to look at the monster they had created, and the hero they were about to crucify. The courtroom was a pressure cooker. Every seat was filled, the air thick with anticipation and the scent of stale coffee. The entire town, it seemed, had crammed into the small wood-paneled room. They were there to witness the unthinkable, the trial of James Brody, their former sheriff, their hero, for the murder of Lila Abernathy. The prosecution, led by a sharp, relentless state prosecutor named Alistair Finch, had built its case meticulously. They had Mike and Leo's testimony about the discovery at the cabin. They had the forensic evidence from the remains. They had Sarah Abernathy's heartbreaking account of her daughter's life and disappearance. But the case rested on 2 pillars. A 33-rolled cassette tape and a grainy photograph. Brody sat at the defense table, a picture of indignant disbelief. He was older, grayer, but he still projected an aura of authority. He looked at the jury, his blue eyes conveying a sense of betrayal, of a good man wrongly accused. His high-priced lawyer, a slick operator from the city, had spent the past week painting Lila as a promiscuous runaway and Ethan as a delusional, attention-seeking failure. He had dismissed the tape as an incoherent, doctored recording and the photo as a meaningless, blurry image. The tension in the courtroom was a palpable living thing. The town was divided. Many still couldn't bring themselves to believe that the man they had admired for so long could be capable of such a monstrous crime. They saw him as a victim, a hero being torn down by a vindictive, headline-grabbing prosecution. The cinematic payoff began when the prosecution called Ethan to the stand. He was a nervous wreck, his hands trembling, his voice barely a whisper. As he was sworn in, he looked out at the sea of faces, at the skeptical, hostile eyes of his former friends and neighbors. He saw his brother, Mark, in the front row. His face a mask of confusion and pain. Finch led him through his testimony, his voice calm and reassuring. Ethan told the court about his secret love for Lila, about the camera that was his constant companion. He described the night of the fair, the fight between Lila and his brother, his own cowardly decision to follow her. "And what did you see in the parking lot, Mr. Collins?" Finch asked. Ethan took a deep breath. "I saw Sheriff Brody grab her." A murmur went through the courtroom. Brody shook his head, a small, dismissive smile on his lips. "He grabbed her, and she fought back," Ethan continued, his voice growing stronger, fueled by the memory of the injustice. "She ran, and he chased her into the woods." Lawyer leaped to his feet. "Objection. The witness is a known fantasist, Your Honor. He has a history of—" "Sit down, Mr. Davies," the judge said, his voice sharp. "The jury will decide what to believe. Continue, Mr. Finch." Finch placed the grainy photograph on the projector. The image filled the screen behind Ethan, a dark silhouette, a flash of auburn hair. "Is this the photograph you took that night, Mr. Collins?" "Yes," Ethan said. "That's him. That's Brody, and that's Lila, running for her life." Davies, on cross-examination, was brutal. He tore into Ethan, attacking his character, his motives, his mental stability. "You were in love with her, weren't you? A pathetic schoolboy crush. You were jealous of your brother. You were jealous of any man she spoke to. Isn't it true that you've held a grudge against Sheriff Brody for years, blaming him for your own miserable, insignificant life?" Ethan weathered the storm, his answers quiet but firm. "I was a coward," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I was scared. I should have done something. I've lived with that every day for 33 years. But I am not a liar." The climax of the trial, the moment that would be seared into the town's collective memory forever, came when the prosecution played the cassette tape. The courtroom fell silent, the only sound the soft hum of the speakers. They heard Lila's voice, young and vibrant, and then the sound of Brody's car, his voice, his words. The air in the room grew cold. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They heard the conversation escalate, the shift from charm to menace. They heard the sound of the struggle, Lila's gasp, her cry to be left alone. Sarah Abernathy sat in the front row, her eyes closed, tears streaming down her face. She was living the horror of her daughter's last moments. When the tape ended, a profound, shocked silence filled the courtroom. The jury, which had been skeptical, now looked at Brody with a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension. The man they had admired, the hero they had revered, was a predator. But the truly explosive moment, the one that would break the internet in a later era, came from an unexpected source. Mark, Ethan's brother, had been sitting in the courtroom, his world crumbling around him. He had listened to his brother's testimony, had seen the photograph, had heard the tape. The hero he had worshipped his entire life had been revealed as a monster. The guilt he had carried for 33 years, the belief that he had been responsible for Lila's disappearance, was being replaced by a sickening, horrifying truth. During a recess, just before the closing arguments, Mark walked out of the courtroom, his face pale, his eyes filled with a terrible resolve. He didn't go to the lawyers. He didn't go to the press. He went straight to the one place he knew Brody would be, the small conference room where he was meeting with his legal team. He burst through the door, his eyes wild. "You son of a bitch," he snarled, his voice raw with a grief and rage that had been festering for 3 decades. Brody looked up, his face a mask of cold fury. "Get out of here, Mark. You're making a mistake." "The mistake was ever believing you," Mark spat. "The mistake was letting you poison this town, letting you poison my mind. You let me believe it was my fault. You let me live with that, you bastard." The confrontation was raw, visceral, a primal scream of betrayal. Mark, the golden boy, the one Brody had groomed and manipulated, was now his accuser. "She came to me that night," Mark said, his voice breaking. "After she ran from you at the cabin, she was terrified. She told me you wouldn't leave her alone. She told me you scared her, and I didn't listen. I was a stupid, arrogant kid, and I didn't listen. I told her she was overreacting. Told her you were a good man." He lunged at Brody, a lifetime of repressed guilt and anger erupting in a single violent motion. The lawyers pulled him back, but the damage was done. A local news reporter, who had been following Mark out of the courtroom, had his phone out, recording the entire confrontation through the glass panel of the door. The video went viral before the jury had even returned with a verdict. It was the cinematic payoff, the courtroom bombshell moment that no one had seen coming. It wasn't just the evidence that convicted Brody, it was the public implosion of his own myth, at the hands of the one person he had so thoroughly deceived. The jury returned in less than an hour. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, guilty, on all counts. As the word was read, a collective gasp went through the courtroom. Brody's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of genuine shock, of disbelief that his world, the world he had so carefully constructed, had come crashing down. He was no longer a hero, he was just a pathetic, old man, a murderer and a rapist. Exposed for all the world to see, as they led him away in handcuffs, his eyes met Sarah's. The mask was gone. In his eyes, she saw nothing but cold, empty hatred. But she didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a quiet, steely strength. She had one. Her daughter had one. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. As Sarah and Ethan emerged, they were met not with hostility, but with a strange, somber silence. Then, someone started to clap. A slow, hesitant applause that grew into a wave of support. They were no longer pariahs, they were the truth-tellers, the ones who had dared to speak out against the darkness. The public justice was explosive, cathartic. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a moral one. The town had been forced to confront its own complicity, its own willful blindness. The cinematic payoff wasn't just the verdict, it was the shattering of a collective delusion, a painful but necessary reckoning that would forever change the soul of their community. The ghost of Leela Abernathy had finally been avenged, not just by the conviction of her killer, but by the reclamation of her truth. The snow fell softly, a thick white blanket that muffled the world in a quiet reverence. It covered the bare branches of the oak trees and settled on the cold granite surface of the new headstone. The stone was simple, elegant, with a single poignant inscription. Leela Abernathy, 197-1989, a daughter, an artist, a dreamer. Finally, at peace. Sarah stood before the grave, her hand resting on the cold stone. The trial was over. Brody was in prison, where he would remain for the rest of his miserable life. The town was slowly, painfully, beginning to heal, to stitch itself back together, after the trauma of the revelation. But for Sarah, the healing was a more complicated, more personal journey. For 33 years, her grief had been a sharp, jagged thing, complicated by uncertainty and betrayal. Now, the uncertainty was gone. She knew what had happened to her daughter. She had her back, not in the way she had always dreamed of, but in a way that allowed for a final, proper goodbye. The grief was still there, a hollow ache in her chest. That would never fully go away, but it was a cleaner grief now. A pure expression of a mother's love for her lost child. She was not alone. Ethan stood a few feet behind her, his camera hanging, unused, around his neck. The trial had been a crucible for him, burning away the last vestiges of his fear and shame. He had faced the town, had faced his own past, and had emerged, scarred but whole. He and Sarah had formed an unlikely bond, a quiet friendship forged in the shared fire of their long-delayed quest for justice. They didn't need to speak much. They understood each other's pain, each other's relief. He had brought something with him. He stepped forward and handed Sarah a small, framed photograph. It was one of his, one from the shoebox. But it wasn't the grainy, horrific image from the woods. It was a picture of Leela, taken a few weeks before she disappeared. She was sitting on a park bench, her head tilted back, laughing, her face bathed in the golden light of a late afternoon sun. Her untamed auburn hair was a fiery halo around her head, and her moss-green eyes were sparkling with a joy that was pure and unadulterated. "This is how I want to remember her," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not as a victim, but as this." Sarah took the photograph, her fingers tracing the outline of her daughter's smiling face. A single tear rolled down her cheek and fell onto the glass. "Thank you," she whispered. "It's beautiful." The aftermath was not a simple, happy ending. It was a bittersweet healing, a quiet reflection on the immense cost of the truth. The town would forever be marked by the scandal. Friendships had been fractured, families torn apart. The name Brody, once a symbol of pride and security, was now a curse, a name whispered with shame and revulsion. Mark, Ethan's brother, had left town shortly after the trial. The weight of his own unwitting complicity, of his hero's monstrous betrayal, had been too much to bear. He and Ethan had had one last, difficult conversation, a painful airing of old wounds and unspoken resentments. There was no easy forgiveness, no simple reconciliation, only a sad, mutual understanding of the damage that had been done. Perhaps, with time, they would find their way back to each other. Perhaps not. For Mike and Leo, the two contractors who had stumbled upon the grave, life had returned to a semblance of normalcy. They were hailed as heroes, but they shied away from the spotlight, uncomfortable with the attention. They had simply been to working men who had done the right thing, but the experience had changed them. They looked at their quiet, familiar town with new eyes, aware of the dark currents that could run beneath even the most placid of surfaces. Every now and then, when working on an old house, one of them would pause, a strange, haunted look in his eyes, as if listening for a voice. From beneath the floorboards, the most haunting reflection came from the cabin itself. The owner, horrified by its history, had wanted to tear it down, but Sarah had asked him not to. Instead, with the help of Ethan and a few other volunteers, she had transformed it. They had repaired the foundation, replaced the rotten wood, and painted the walls a bright, cheerful yellow. It was no longer a tomb. It was a memorial dot inside. On the walls, they hung Lila's drawings, the vibrant, hopeful sketches she had made in her secret sanctuary. They were full of life, of color, of a talent that had never been allowed to fully blossom. In the center of the room, on an easel, they placed the framed photograph that Ethan had given Sarah. It became a place of pilgrimage, a quiet space for reflection. People would come and leave flowers on the porch. Teenagers, the same age Lila had been, would come and sit on the steps, talking in hushed tones, absorbing the story, the cautionary tale that had become a lesson in courage and truth. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after the trial, Sarah was at the cabin, tending to the small garden she had planted out front. A car pulled up, and a young woman got out. She was an art student from a nearby city, and she had been following the story. "I just wanted to see her work," the young woman said, her eyes full of a sincere, respectful curiosity. She was so talented. Sarah smiled, a genuine warm smile. "Yes," she said. She led the young woman inside and watched as she moved from drawing to drawing. Her expression, a mixture of admiration and sadness. "It's so tragic," the student said, pausing before the portrait of Leela, to think of what she could have become. Sarah looked at the laughing face of her daughter in the photograph. The ache in her chest was still there, a dull, familiar pain. But for the first time, It was mixed with something else. A sense of peace. A sense of pride. She became a symbol, Sarah said, her voice soft but clear. She became a voice for all the other girls who were silenced. Her story, her truth, it came out. It cost us everything, but it came out. And that's not a tragedy. That's a victory. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Sarah stood alone in the doorway of the cabin, looking out at the woods where her daughter had run for her life. The wind whispered through the pines, and for a moment, it sounded like a laugh, a free, untamed laugh, too loud for a church, but perfect for the vast, open expanse of the sky. The emotional echo of Leela's life, of her fight, of her ultimate, costly triumph, would linger in that place forever, a haunting, bittersweet reminder that even a voice buried in darkness for 33 years can eventually find its way into the light.